Hello and welcome to D-Day Conneaut 2020. My name's Lisa Dousharm, and I'd like to thank every single one of you for chiming in and listening to this presentation. But before we begin, I'd like to give you some background on how I began reenacting. I have been reenacting for the last 35 years. Thanks to the passion of history from both my father and some social studies teachers in high school and college, I have literally been running up and down the timeline ever since. Some of the other historical impressions that I have been doing are the Golden Age of Piracy and Americans' Old or Wild West. Now, I got involved in doing World War II approximately, I would say, 2009. A friend of mine and fellow reenactor, Mike Blazejack, convinced me that I should be doing a female military persona. Well, with that said, I started doing some research, and it became personal because I realized that my father's family was very involved in World War II, both here in the States and in the UK. And with that, I discovered that doing the persona of a woman's auxiliary Air Force officer was a perfect fit. By 1938, the Royal Air Force companies had existed within the Auxiliary Territorial Service, better known as the ATS. Now, this female force was equivalent to the Territorial Army. By May of '39, the British government decided that a separate women's air service was necessary. Within a year, tens of thousands of women volunteered their time to serve, ranging from ages 18 to 40. And by 41, the WAAF had become a part of the armed forces of the Crown. Despite the difference in backgrounds, all of them had to endure the rigorous schedules of service life. Lack of privacy, basic facilities, tedious work schedules, shifts, along with inspections. Even above and beyond the standard, everyday, grueling schedule, they did find friendship and camaraderie, which helped combat the feelings of loneliness and homesickness. Originally, the jobs performed by the women of the WAAF were domestic by nature. As an example, cooking or driving. But soon they expanded on their jobs and training, such as meteorology, administrative work, and, of course, maintaining and repairing aircraft. However, during the Battle of Britain, the RAF was under huge strain. Therefore, the WAAF had to change. It was essential that these women had to take on more technical roles, so they were trained in radar plotting, maintenance of barrage balloons, and photographic interpretation. In doing so, the practical work undertaken by the WAAF helped not only provide moral support, but kept the RAF flying high. During Operation Overlord, the 303 Squadron were equipped with Spitfires, which was part of the air defense of Great Britain. On D-Day, June 6, 1944, the 303 Squadron was part of the aerial mission over the landing beaches of Normandy. And this ends my presentation. I'd like to thank you again for chiming in and watching. And if you have an opportunity to come and visit D-Day Conneaut next year, I look forward to seeing you. Until then, be safe, and hopefully we'll be able to see each other. Take care.
Hi, my name is Marie. I am a living historian, and I am also the manager for the Warfront in Seattle, which is a military store that specializes in military antiques and collectibles from the Civil War all the way up to the Vietnam War era. I've been asked to talk a little bit about my experience at D-Day, Ohio, but also to talk about one of my favorite impressions, which is the SPAR, or the United States Auxiliary Reservist for the Coast Guard. This is this would have been my 4th year at D-Day, Ohio. The first year I didn't quite know what to expect, but I had several friends who had been to the event, and I wanted to go ahead and find a good place where I could meet everyone in one spot. And so I flew not quite knowing what to expect, and I found much more than friendship and kinship. The experience was amazing. I got to do things that you can't quite do in a regular living history or reenactment setting, and I got to go ahead and meet veterans who are the reason why I do what I do today. For the most part, I love those guys so much. Generally, at D-Day, have been doing United States Navy waves as an impression. But I have the SPARs near and dear to my heart. It's a less common impression and a less common uniform, since their number were not exactly tremendous. Before World War II, women could volunteer or be on a volunteer base in the Coast Guard, but they were mostly women that were daughters of wealthy boat owners, or that worked on family boats and had a good sense of nautical skills. When the Navy took over the Coast Guard about a month before the beginning of our involvement within World War II, they started looking for someone that could direct and lead a women's auxiliary branch quite keenly, and with all of the acumen that it would take. So they picked Dorothy Stratton, who was the Dean of Women at Purdue University, and was already used to working into a tough men environment. She took over, and she recruited initially about 200 women from the U.S. Navy waves, and created this branch that supported the men of the United States Coast Guard in various tasks. But they recruited women that were, unlike the other branches, much more athletic, with a stronger body, so that they could swim, so that they could be able to go ahead and carry very intense nautical tasks, and understood the sea and the culture that went with it. The SPARS is by far one of the least commonly known and most adored branch of the service for women during World War II. I couldn't have loved this uniform more. This is a working uniform. As you can see, it's quite similar to the uniform for the U.S. Navy Wave, to the exception of the tally, which proudly displays the United States Coast Guard, as well as the insignias, which both enlisted and officers women wore, and the shield, which also indicated that she was a SPAR and not a wave. And to close this short video, actually, SPAR is not an acronym for, not exactly an acronym for what their name is, but Dorothy Stratton, back in the day, decided to name them like this because of the United States Coast Guard motto, which is Semper Paratus, which means always ready. If you put Semper Paratus and always ready, you get SPARs. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the field.
Hello, my name is Hannah, and I'm going to share with you today one of my most favorite impressions that I do, one of my favorite impressions that I have done at D-Day, Ohio. So who you see me as today is a member of the British Women's Land Army, or the WLA. So the WLA actually got its beginnings in World War I, and then was disbanded, and then was reestablished during World War II. So to give you some kind of the backdrop of why the WLA came to be, prior to World War II, a good percentage of Great Britain's food was imported. But preceding the war and during the war, it became very dangerous and really impossible to import food because merchant ships became targets of German U-boats. So Great Britain found itself needing to very quickly become self-sustaining in terms of food production. That looked like a couple of major changes in the agricultural industry in Great Britain. So the first big change was that the British government now kind of dictated what farmers could farm, what kind of crops they could farm, and what kind of livestock. So an example would be livestock that's raised for meat production. Meat will only go so far, will only feed so many mouths. But when you have a dairy farm, your dairy cows are going to be producing food, and they're going to keep producing it and keep producing and keep producing. So that's more bang for your buck, so to speak. So that was one major change that happened in the agricultural scene in England during the Second World War. But the other major change is that up to that point, traditionally, farm laborers had been men. Well, now all of the young men were serving in the military. So the Women's Land Army came about to recruit young women to work the farms and basically keep Great Britain fed during the war. So a lot of young women, the idea of joining the Women's Land Army was attractive to a lot of young women because maybe they didn't want to be conscripted into the armed forces, or maybe get stuck with a desk job. So that was a main reason why a lot of women decided to join. They got to work in the great outdoors. And I do have with me, here, I'll give you a little bit of a closer look, some recruiting posters that the WLA used. So these would definitely glamorize life on a farm and glamorize farm labor. And so a lot of girls were in for kind of a rude awakening when they actually got to their farm assignments, because it was a lot more difficult than what the recruitment posters made it out to be. So if you had just joined the Women's Land Army, you would probably start your service out by going to an agricultural school for maybe about a month, and they would train you maybe in one or two specific aspects of farming. So you might be trained on how to raise and harvest a specific kind of crop, maybe sugar beets. But that didn't necessarily mean that you would then get that assignment. You might then be assigned to a dairy farm and have not the slightest clue of how to care for cows. And you would just have to learn on the fly. So you might be assigned to a large farm with a bunch of other land girls, and maybe be billeted in a hostel, like a dorm environment, very little privacy, crowded quarters. Or you might be assigned to a smaller farm by yourself and live a very solitary life. Living conditions in the British countryside on a farm could sometimes be really quite primitive. It was very uncommon at that point to have indoor plumbing or heating. So it was kind of rough living, and rationing was also in place. So land girls would start their day, before sunup and work till sundown, so maybe a 15, 16-hour day, and rationing was in place, so food might not be readily available, and they would have to do this hard farm labor, typically on very little sustenance. You might have a piece of toast and some tea for breakfast, and maybe a Marmite sandwich out in the field in the afternoon, and then maybe boiled potatoes at night. So it was by no means an easy job. So you could be assigned to a farm that was producing crops. So you would be in charge of plowing, sowing, harvesting a certain kind of crop. Or you might be assigned to a dairy farm, and you would have to look out for the cows' welfare, their medical welfare. You would have to milk them multiple times a day, feed them, take them to pasture, bring them back from pasture, produce their food for the winter, and deliver the milk to the surrounding area as well. Or you might not be assigned to a farm at all. You could have been assigned to the timber corps. And I have another picture here. You can see this picture here and also this bottom picture here, who are working in the timber corps, felling trees for lumber that was, of course, much needed during the war as well. I'll kind of wrap it up today by talking a little bit about what a member of the Women's Land Army would have been wearing. What am I wearing? What were some of the different uniforms that you would have seen them in? So when you joined the Women's Land Army, everyone was supposed to have been issued a couple of standard uniform pieces. So your first would be a dress uniform or a walking out uniform. And that would have consisted of a brown felt hat, a kind of off-white collared shirt with a forest green tie, a forest green knit wool sweater, corduroy breeches, and knee-high wool socks, and then brown low-quarter leather shoes. Your official work uniform would have been kind of similar. You still would have had the green wool sweater, and then you would have had, like what I'm wearing today, you would have had khaki coveralls and a belt at the waist. Now, in reality, a lot of girls would be issued mismatching uniform pieces. Maybe you wouldn't get all of the uniform pieces you were supposed to, maybe ill-fitting garment pieces, and some were never issued their uniforms at all and kind of had to make do with what they had. You also have to consider, if you're working out in the summertime in the middle of a field all day, you're probably not going to be wanting to wear a wool sweater. So I have another picture here. Well, let me show you a picture first of the work uniform that was kind of the standard issue. So here, this is a good picture, good example here. They are all in their green wool sweaters and their khaki coveralls. That's what you should have been issued, but a lot of girls were more comfortable wearing kind of mismatched pieces of whatever they could get their hands on. So in this picture here, this bottom picture here, you can see everyone's wearing something different. So she looks like she's wearing her standard coveralls that she would have been issued. She's wearing coveralls, but they're a totally different color. Some of them are wearing trousers, and all of them are wearing different pattern cotton blouses and different kinds of headscarves in their hair. So ultimately, a lot of them would kind of just wear whatever was most practical for their assignment on the farm. So that's what I'm wearing today, just kind of a basic what I'd be wearing in the field. I have my issued khaki coveralls and belt, but then a personal purchase cotton blouse to keep cooler while doing work out in the field. So that is where I will leave you today. That's kind of the Women's Land Army in a nutshell. There is so much more I could say and so many more stories I could share, but I'll just leave you with kind of that little gem today. I thank you all for listening, And I hope that I have sparked your interest in the Women's Land Army. There's so many great memoirs and stories out there if you would like to do more reading and more research. So thank you again for listening, and it was my pleasure to share a little bit about the WLA with you. Thank you. Bye.
My name's Cathy. I've been interested in living history for the last 20 years or so, but I started reenacting in earnest 5 years ago after an event in Conneaut, Ohio, the D-Day event, where I was totally enthralled and decided to take part in something that's bigger than myself. So I'd like to talk to you today a little bit about the Women's Army Corps, affectionately known as the WAAF. My goal is to explain some misunderstandings and to talk to you about some things that are near and dear to my heart. The things that keep me involved with reenacting the Women's Army Corps. A little bit of background history on the Women's Army Corps. One of the misunderstandings also, when we're at an event, people will ask us or assume that we are nurses. And the short answer to that is no. No, WACs are not nurses. There is a nurse corps already, the Army Nurses Corps, that was established in like 1901. So it makes sense that we would be confused as that. They have been around so much longer. But the Women's Army Corps came into being in 1942 when a law was passed. It was brought into Congress by a congresswoman named Edith North Rogers out of Massachusetts. And her goal was to make sure that any woman who volunteered to be involved in the war would get the same compensation and retirement and pension, so to speak, that the men did. And she did this because at the end of World War I, women who did volunteer to work with the Army were sent home and basically forgotten. It wasn't until 1970 that the only 11 remaining women got their pensions for their work in World War I. The compromise in Congress, because they weren't quite ready to give women full status. And it took 1 year, a little over 1 year, in 1943, that the law was signed to become the Women's Army Corps. So if you ever see the initials WAAC, that was only 1 year of time until the women so proved themselves so valuable that they were Congress was finally willing to create just the Women's Army Corps, giving women the same pay and the same pension as their male counterparts. And one of my favorite little one-liners from that time period is they thought that it would take 2 women to replace 1 man in a job. And what they found out is that a woman could do the job of 2 men and eat less, so they were less expensive. Now, I'd like to elaborate a little bit on the jobs that were available for women in the Women's Army Corps. I have told you that one of them is not nursing. That was the short answer. I said no. But there were over 200 MOSs, or 200 job descriptions, that women could do. They could be involved with medicine, maybe as a technician in a laboratory, maybe as an assistant in surgery, reading x-rays, but women had so many others. They could make maps, draw maps. They could be a photographer. They could be a mechanic. They could be a driver. And what you may have seen if you've ever come to the D-Day Ohio event, you may have seen us, many of the WACs, working in a message center attached to the 17th Signal Corps. That's one of the main, I guess most of the women who were working in the Women's Army Corps would have done some sort of clerical work, a typist, working a switchboard, working the phones themselves, or sending messages. That's what you'll see us doing at the event if we were there this year. So what I'd like to do now is maybe a segue into two of my friends who are willing to display for you some of those duties. So Lauren, you will see using a typewriter, and maybe you could imagine her typing those orders for the invasion of Normandy on D-Day. It was women who typed those. It was members of the Women's Army Corps who held those secrets of the invasion because they were the ones typing those orders. So think of Lauren doing that. Or as she sends messages, think of that as the most common way that messages were sent on the battlefield. It wasn't phones or radios or even Morse code. It was handwritten messages. You'll also see Amanda demonstrating Morse code for you.
As Cathy mentioned, typewriters were commonly used in World War II for clerical and administrative purposes, as well as sending messages. Messages arrive at the message center a lot of different ways, whether it be by telegraph, teletype, radio, dispatch, and that's just naming a few. The type and urgency of the message, as well as the ability or the technology of the recipient, will help determine how that message gets sent. So, for example, if you have a message marked urgent, you're more likely going to be sending that by radio as opposed to waiting for the scheduled messenger to go out on their route for the day. For the majority of messages, you're going to be writing them out into a message book, which copies them in triplicate and ensures for comprehensive record keeping. When filling out the message book, there was a uniform style that had to be learned. Utilizing this style would help ensure that messages could be read and understood. I think we all know somebody with sloppy handwriting that's hard to decipher. It would also differentiate between commonalities. For example, I was just a vertical line, but 1 has a horizontal line at the base. O is just a circle, but 0 has a line through it. As you can imagine, there's also a very specific method to filling out the message book as well. This is actually an example from the War Department's Basic Field Manual for Signal Communications. As you can see by the top row, this has not been processed through the message center yet. If you notice some WAAFs scurrying around D-Day Conneaut last year with a clipboard, most likely they were dispatching messages on their delivery route regarding the temperature, tactical changes, and other important updates. I now would like to pass you on to Amanda, who's going to teach you a little bit about the use of Morse in World War II.
The WAAFs who worked with and supported the Signal Corps performed many different jobs. These included working as high-speed radio operators, teletype operators, switchboard operators, cryptographic code clerks, crypto analysts, and route clerks. The WAAFs selected for these jobs were often recruited because they had appropriate post-secondary education, work experience, or language skills such as German. The WAAFs had to complete difficult training and were expected to quickly master the skills and technology necessary to perform their jobs. For instance, the ladies were expected to learn Morse code with total proficiency in only a few weeks. Morse code is a method for encoding text into standardized sequences of 2 different signal lengths called dots and dashes, or dits and dahs, that can be sent by means of sound, light, electrical current, or radio waves. They can be decoded by a skilled listener without special equipment. The system is named after the American artist Samuel Morse, who co-developed an electrical telegraph system at the beginning of 1836. The dots and dashes of Morse code, often referred to as CW or continuous wave, are sent by turning on and off an electrical current, or in the case of radio, a radio wave. For instance, the letter R is 1 short dit, 1 long dash, and another short dit. It sounds like this. Even though by World War II, voice could be sent over the radio and telephone lines was a common form of communication, Morse was still in frequent use by both the Allied and Axis forces. This is because with both radio and wired transmissions, Morse requires very little energy to transmit over long distances. Also, as the technology is so simple, it can be received even with a weak signal or distortion where a human voice would be intelligible. An extremely important job that the WAAFs did was to intercept coded enemy messages. These messages were being received in encrypted Morse code, which meant that the intercepting WAAF would have to listen for hours on end to random strings of numbers and letters in Morse code. Often the radio transmissions were weak or contained interference, which would require even more concentration. Once copied, these messages were then sent to SIS headquarters, where other WAAFs, soldiers, and civilians would work to decode them. This meant that the messages had to be recorded with the utmost accuracy, as any mistake in the copying could hinder the code-breaking efforts.
And another misconception, or the last misconception, one of my goals that I said I had, was to straighten some things out. We have been asked or inferred at D-Day, Ohio, why women are there. Women did not storm the beach at Normandy, and that's true. We weren't storming the beach at Normandy. So now you may be asking or wondering, why am I in a field uniform? So those are the things I'm going to explain to you. Yes or no, we were not storming the beach, but women were involved in the D-Day invasion. As I mentioned earlier, typing those orders about the invasion, but they were stationed in London. Women's Army Corps members didn't arrive on Normandy, but they did arrive on Normandy 38 days after the landing. They arrived basically in the uniform I'm wearing right now, except they would have carried all their gear with them. There were 49 enlisted women and 5 officers, and as they came on the beach at Normandy, they set up tents, pyramid tents, pump tents, and they lived in an apple orchard right alongside the men. They lived in the rain, exact same conditions as the men, and they followed the army. After that, around Europe, through France and into Germany. One of the stories I like to tell from that is when they were running short of water, the women would actually use their helmet, one helmet full of water, and they would share it to brush teeth, wash their hair, and even wash their clothes. So again, my job or my goal today, again, was to clear up a couple of misunderstandings. No, we weren't on Normandy, but we did come. The Women's Army Corps did come just later, wearing the uniform you see me in. And the other one that I wanted to clear up is that when you see a reenactor portraying Women's Army Corps, remember the Army Nurse Corps is a different unit. We had other jobs. So I hope I've maybe piqued your interest just a little bit, and if you ever can come to the D-Day Ohio event, look us up to see us in the Message Center. Thank you.